We thank you very much for inviting us here to share our lived experience of walking alongside a child with a terminal illness. And it's our hope that through our testimony today, you'll receive some insight into how to deliberate and what to recommend to Parliament. My wife will begin, and then I will conclude.
This is our dear son, Marcus. On February 26, 2021, he was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, an aggressive form of bone cancer. After 20 rounds of chemotherapy, 25 rounds of radiation, numerous surgeries, including the replacement of his entire upper right arm with an internal prosthetic, we made the decision with Marcus and his doctors to end treatment for cure and focus on quality of life. Marcus's care was then transferred from BC Children's Hospital to Canuck Place Children's Hospice. The palliative and hospice care Marcus received at our home was focused on addressing his suffering and valuing his dignity. The doctors and nurses knew his days would be short, and their efforts ensured that the days he had left were lived well. Marcus wanted to die at home, surrounded by his family, but he also didn't want to experience the intense pain and suffering that he knew would come as his lungs filled with tumors. On what turned out to be his last Friday, Nurse Shanna assessed Marcus and said, "His time is short." She advised us to take the window we still had for Marcus to be transported to Canuck Place Hospice in Vancouver. With the increased intensity of his care, we agreed. Our whole family was together at the hospice, and as we entered the evening, it appeared that Marcus would only last a few more hours. As each of his siblings said goodnight to Marcus, he told them he loved them and said, "See you in paradise." Mike and I didn't sleep at all, but took turns sitting beside Marcus. The nurses maintained his medication, and Marcus assured us that he was very comfortable and not in any pain. At one point, he said to me, "This is how I hoped it would be." As dawn arrived, we realized that God had another day in store for Marcus. Early that morning, Marcus's friends arrived at the hospice, and together they cried, laughed, and prayed. That afternoon, both Marcus's sets of grandparents also came to say goodbye. By early Sunday morning, Marcus was non-responsive, and his breathing had become a lot more shallow. Just before 2:30 that afternoon, Marcus's breathing slowed, and with each of us around his bedside, he took his final, peaceful breaths.
Marcus died just 6 short months ago on May 29th, 2022, only 15 months after his diagnosis. If he was here today, his appeal to you would be to not expand euthanasia to minors for 2 reasons. Earlier this month, it was reported in the news that CAMAP, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, is recommending that physicians have an obligation to bring up medical assistance in dying with patients who meet eligibility requirements. As Jennifer just outlined, Marcus met all the eligibility requirements. This means that if euthanasia is extended to minors, the day will come when families just like ours, with their dying children, will feel an obligation to end the suffering of their child by having a doctor euthanize him or her. Dear committee members, we recommend against the expansion of euthanasia because by giving some minors the right to request, you put all minors and their families in a position where they are obliged to consider. If that happened to Marcus, the message he would have heard would have been clear. We don't value your life. We don't think it is worth living. And if you want, we can end it for you. It would have said to him, we are giving up on you. Honorable members, we should never give up on our children. The second reason we recommend you don't extend MAID to minors is because by doing so, you eliminate unimaginably beautiful experiences. When we went to the Canuck Place Children's Hospice, we didn't know how long Marcus would live. We hadn't even wanted to go to the hospice initially, but being there allowed us to embrace each moment we had with him and him with us. If euthanasia becomes available to minors, then that Friday night when we thought Marcus was going to go, after we'd all had our time with him to say our goodbyes, it would have seemed like the thing to do, right? It's time, the nurse would say. It's the compassionate thing to do. He doesn't have to suffer anymore. But then we would not have had Saturday, a most beautiful day, shared with our son, our brother, and our friend. We suffered much with Marcus, and we miss him terribly. But Marcus showed us. He showed us how to find meaning in suffering, and he was thankful for each day that God gave to him. And therefore, it is our heartfelt recommendation to this committee on behalf of Marcus and our family that you do not extend MAID to minors, and instead focus on providing the necessary, robust, palliative, and hospice care resources to ensure the best quality of living, even when someone is dying. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Schultons for your courageous testimony this morning. I cannot imagine being in your shoes, but the fact that you were able to share this testimony with us was very powerful. So we'll go into our first round of questions. We'll begin with Mr. Cooper. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you to the witnesses, and in particular, thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Schuten for your powerful and heartfelt testimony. And I wish to express my condolences for your loss of your son. And I want to maybe start with a general question. It sounds like your son, Marcus, had no desire to die. He wanted to live. But we also heard testimony from a mother whose son was 16. MAID was not available to him, and she gave powerful testimony before the committee that if he had the option of MAID, it would have resulted in him ending his suffering just a little sooner before he passed on. So what would you say in a situation like that, and what would you say in response to that mother's very powerful testimony before this committee?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I think that we need to remember that perspective is everything. And we also need to acknowledge the influence and ability of parents, of government, of healthcare providers to influence children in our country. So if the perspective through suffering is that this suffering is going to get worse, there's unimaginable things that might or could happen to you, your life might be very short, then that leads to despair. And as Viktor Frankl once said, he said, despair is suffering without meaning. And if that's the perspective that we're portraying to children who are suffering from terminal illness, then I can agree with you that might lead to despair, which could include a request for medical assistance in dying. But if the perspective is, as our experience, right from the very day that Marcus's oncologist said to him, there's nothing more we can do. When Marcus asked him, how long do I have? The doctor said, we don't know, and we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on living every day you have well, and we're going to do everything we can to ensure you can live every day you have well. That perspective does not lead to despair, and that perspective does not lead to someone's request to ask a doctor to euthanize him or her.
Thank you for that. Now, Mr. Schuten, you mentioned in your testimony that the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors has come up with a recommendation that medical doctors have an obligation to mention or bring up MAID when their patients meet the eligibility requirements. Can you speak to what impact you think that may have in terms of end-of-life care, and in particular to mature minors, should MAID be expanded to mature minors?
Mm-hmm. I think as we've seen in in other demographics in our country, that obligation to consider is happening more and more. While we were at Canuck Place Hospice on more than one occasion, we expressed gratitude that euthanasia for children was not legal in Canada, and that was not part of the suite of options that the doctors and healthcare providers had in order to treat our son. All of his treatment, all of his care was focused on him living well. And in the end, it wasn't day by day. It was hour by hour, moment by moment. And when those resources are there, the request for someone to die and ask a doctor to end that suffering by euthanizing them, it doesn't happen.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And can you speak to Marcus's experience in the end-of-life care that he received and how that measures up against palliative care and long-term care that most adults receive?
Mm-hmm. About 6 months before Marcus was diagnosed, I had an uncle who was 69. I was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He did not have his first appointment with an oncologist until after he had passed away. Our doctors, through the child system, were always ahead of us, whereas my uncle's wife had to run around all over the place trying to find treatment for him, trying to find the right medication, trying to address every symptom that came up. In our case, through BC Children's Hospital and the Canuck Place Children's Hospice, they were always ahead of us, so much so that as my wife said, that Friday morning, they knew that this was the time. They knew Marcus wanted to stay home, but they said, if you have a window to get to Canuck Place Children's Hospice, this is now. So that made us able, as a family, to spend every living moment we had yet with Marcus living well, enjoying each moment we had with him, sharing laughs, sharing memories, him telling us over and over that he loved us. When he was in the hospice and said to, as Jennifer indicated in her testimony, this is how I hoped it would be, that's how he hoped it would be. Surrounded by his family, surrounded by healthcare professionals who didn't give up on him, who didn't say, your life is not worth living, you might want to request us to end it. They considered his life worth living right up to the moment that he passed away at the hospice.
I'd like to start by greeting our witnesses warmly today and thank the Schulten family for their courageous testimony. It's the worst thing that could happen to parents, and my parents lost their daughter, my sister, and I saw how that devastated my parents, so I find you to be extremely courageous, and I know that even with time it's difficult to get through this, but there is always light at the end of the tunnel. That's what I would say to you. And Mr. or Mrs. Schulten, could you remind me the age of your son when he passed, please?
Yes. When Marcus was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, he was 17 years old. And when we buried him in the ground, he was 18 years old.
Okay, merci.
Thank you. Well, that is a segue to my question. If we interpret the Carter decision, which brought us to the era of MAID in Canada, a person needs to be a major under the Criminal Code, 18. Now, some witnesses have said that in other countries, not a lot of countries, but where there are countries where MAID is offered for some age groups where kids are very sick and they become mature because of their illness or disease and being in and out of hospitals throughout their lives. Some of them have expressed the need for MAID, but saying that parents should be consulted, but at the end of the day, it was the child's decision that would take precedence, that would trump anyone else's decision, and that they would be entitled to request MAID from healthcare teams. Now, what I'm going to ask you, in light of the cruel experience that you had, your son was 17, 18, but were made to be offered in Canada one day to minors, and things are still not clear in my head. What age would be the cutoff in your opinion, and what guardrails or safeguards would have to be in place in the case of mature minors, please?
So would you mind being brief in your response? There's less than a minute remaining.
Sure. I will just speak to the experience that we had, because that's our lived experience. Friday evening, Marcus thought that he was going to go. And he called us all to his bedside and told us that he loved us. And Saturday morning, when he was still with us, and I said to him, Marcus, should I see if your buddies are able to come to the hospice? These friends that you see on the picture right in front of you. His eyes lit up. And he said, if you could, that would be so good. And he had 90 minutes of time with them, where he wouldn't have had that time if the decision for medical assistance in dying had happened. And he had that time because everyone around him, from his parents to his healthcare providers, valued his dignity, valued his life, and did everything they could to ensure that he lived well, even though he was dying, even though over the course of 2 months, he drowned to death as his lungs filled with tumors. There's not much more a terrible way you can go. But we can in our country, and our experience is proof of that. We can care for each other and give each other that dignity so that the request for MAID doesn't have to be there.
Next, we'll go to...
Merci aux témoins.
Thank you very much to the witnesses.
Thank you. And Monsieur Thériault, you have 5 minutes at this time.
Oui, d'abord.
Well, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Schulten. My sincere condolences. Your testimony really touched me. And I understand that you're still in the grieving process, probably, and I hope that in some way today's experience can help to alleviate your suffering and help you through this process of grieving in some small way. Now, there is a woman who testified just like you are today. My colleague, Mr. Cooper, alluded to her, Ms. Marco, who was the mother of Charles. Now, Charles was 17 years, 9 months, and had a bone cancer too. It was a very pervasive bone cancer. And over the course of 2 years, well, he died 2 years after the diagnosis. On that exact day, 2 years later, he died by sedation as part of his palliative care. He fought, he was brave, he was courageous, he fought at every stage, but he never had any respite, no remission, and he lost out to the disease. And for him, what his mother told us, because she undertook to testify before us, and she said that free choice was important to him, and that for him, medical assistance in dying was his way of winning over the disease, and that it didn't determine it. At least he had an opportunity to decide in serenity, surrounded by his loved ones, when he would go, that he would choose this moment. And when I look at the photo, well, I look at the photo on the table that you've put there, and I feel that your testimony could have been completely different. Now, this kind of experience is also occurring in the context of palliative care, where children are requesting, or mature minors are requesting MAID. Now, Mr. Liu made his presentation today. Youth are like adults to the extent that some are in favour of MAID, some are against MAID. But what of the role of the state? Is it not precisely to ensure that one has the option, the opportunity to exercise one's free choice in the context of the most intimate decision, their own death, and how they wish to live out that death?
As I said earlier, perspective is everything. 2 weeks before Marcus passed away, someone had gifted us with funds to use an Airbnb on Vancouver Island. We almost didn't make it because on the way, we had to stop at BC Children's Hospital to empty Marcus's lungs with 2 liters of liquid. That's how sick he was. But because that precious time had been given to us, he wanted to use it. He recognized, as I said in my testimony, that when you unnaturally interrupt life through medical assistance in dying, you miss out on beautiful experiences that you can have. It's one thing to ask healthy, able-bodied minors in our country, if you received this diagnosis and life looked this terrible, would you want medical assistance in dying? And they say, yeah, I think so. It's an entirely other thing to actually experience it yourself or with your child and have available the palliative and hospice resources to care for said illness.
Now, Mr. Liu just said the opposite to us. These are young people who are healthy. Now, if your Marcus had said to you, that is what I want, well, what Ms. Marcus said to us, had Charles wanted this, she would have been there for him had he wished to endure through his suffering. And she would also have supported his decision to interrupt his life at a specific moment. Now, had your Marcus said, I want to put an end to this with the help of MAID, would you have supported him? Would you have agreed with his decision? Because that's something we need to take into account, the role of the parents.
Again, just to reiterate, that Friday night, Marcus, he wanted to die. He was ready to die. He was ready to go and meet Jesus. He's a Christian. And he didn't. And then that Saturday, he had beautiful experiences with his best friends and with his family and with his grandparents. Marcus wanted to die. He was ready to die. But if by asking a doctor Friday night to end his life, he would have missed out on those beautiful opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Schutten. And lastly, we'll have Mr. McGregor, who has the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. And I would like to start with the Schuttens. First of all, in echoing my colleagues, I'd like to thank you both for having the courage to appear before our committee and to share your personal experiences with your son, Marcus. What we're struggling with here is respecting a person's autonomy. And I guess the question I want to pose to you is, under BC law, because I'm also a resident of British Columbia, we have a provincial law, the Infants Act, which defines what mature minor consent is. So essentially, children under provincial law, they can refuse health care if the healthcare provider assesses them and determines that they have the necessary understanding to give that consent. So, for example, if there was a child living with a terminal illness and the healthcare provider had the understanding that they could give consent, that child could say, well, I don't want you to resuscitate me. I want to refuse feeding. I want to refuse all kinds of life-saving measures should my body fail. So perhaps I could ask you for your perspective on that, because that is a way for a child under the age of 18, essentially giving their consent that if my body is, I don't want to be resuscitated. Can you maybe frame your answer? Because that's a child making a decision on their end-of-life care. And how, in your mind, does that differentiate from a child using that same autonomy to say, I want to choose the time and space of my passing, and maybe I want to do it so that I can have my family members and friends come at a predetermined time, and I can then go out the way I want to?
I think two things come to mind as you ask your question. One is that our experience is that all throughout Marcus's treatment, he was very involved. Right from the first bad scan, where it showed that before the cancer had even been gone, it was back into his lungs. And Marcus was consulted. It was his decision to continue to proceed with treatment. It was his decision that day that my wife referenced when our oncologist said there's nothing more we can do. It was his decision, along with us, to say, I want treatment so that my quality of life is as good as it can be in the days that I have left. The other thought, as you ask your question, is that to emphasize the point that when you make it available to minors, then people like Marcus, families like ours, will be in a position where they're obliged to consider this. That doesn't sound like autonomy to me.
Okay, thank you for that answer and perspective. I respect that.
Thank you very much. And I do have another question for one for Mr. and Mrs. Schulten. Yes, good morning. It's the worst kind of thing that could happen to anyone that's happened to you in your lives. Now, in a past life, I worked in the field of palliative care as a family doctor, and families, when they were supporting their loved ones, regardless of their age, they said that 24 to 48 hours before the individual dies was the most incredible period of their lives. And, I just do have a question, though. Since MAID is being considered an option for mature minors, would they be forced to agree to it? Everyone says, oh, well, we're proposing death to them, but should they in any way be forced to agree? And as parents, since it's on the table, would you ever feel that you should encourage your son to choose MAID?
So I think that you mentioned palliative care and how important that is. And when the palliative care is focused on...
I'm sorry. I know that I did refer to palliative care, but I just wanted to communicate that I understood what you experienced. But what I'm trying to get at is if MAID is offered to our youth, would they be forced to agree to it? Or in your opinion, as parents, would you feel guilty in some way for feeling that you might tell your son, oh, well, to alleviate suffering, would you like to consider MAID? If this were on the table for mature minors, how would you feel?
If we would have suggested to our son to consider medical assistance in dying, or if his healthcare providers would have said to him, would you like to consider medical assistance in dying? The message he would have heard is, you're giving up on me. And that would lead to despair, and that would further entrench the desire to have medical assistance in dying. We are incredibly grateful and thankful that our healthcare providers, as well as us as parents, were given the strength to ensure Marcus that every day it was going to be a day worth living, no matter how much suffering came.
Thank you. We'll now go to Senator Kutcher.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And for the Schutens, as a parent myself and a grandparent and a physician who has sat with many people who have lost their children, I know that it's the most difficult thing, and I'm so sorry for your loss. Our challenge is to try to understand this in a much more complex way, and you help us think about important issues. And this is going to be a difficult question, but I want you to grapple with it, please. Your son chose to die in a specific way, and we respect that. We respect his choice of how to do it, surrounded by his family and the support that you gave him. But we also know that not all of those in similar circumstances would necessarily make the same choice. And we also know that not all families in the same circumstances would also make the same choice. So do you respect that others in similar circumstances may choose a different path for their end of life? maybe different than your son and different than your perspectives. Maybe they have different values, different ways of understanding the world. Would you respect that if their choice and their family's choice was made, or should they be denied access to MAID?
It wasn't Marcus's choice to die, just to clarify. Marcus wanted to live. He didn't want to die. He was given a terminal illness outside of our control that we were responsible with. How do we respond to this? How do we live with this now? And we've shared with you this morning on how we did that. I can acknowledge that there are other families where, as I indicated earlier, if you focus on the suffering and on despair and on how terrible life is going to get, that can and will lead to a request to die. There were times in Marcus's illness when he wanted to die. The pain was a lot. He wanted to die. But immediately, the healthcare providers found ways to address that pain, not by suggesting to him, "You're right, we're going to give up on you, here's the option now." If that would have happened, he very likely would have died way sooner than he did.
I hear what you're saying, but people may have a different perspective than yours. And if they have a different perspective, and if they may not agree with your statement, would you respect their ability to make that decision?
I respect that people have a different viewpoint on this and approach it with a different worldview, but our appeal to you is that if you open up euthanasia for minors, then even families like ours who would not support that decision will feel obliged to consider it. That's what's problematic here. And as CAMAP it's been recently revealed, is happening already in our country. And for that to happen to families sitting in places like the Canuck Place Children's Hospice would be incredibly, incredibly a negative experience for them.
Thank you. Nous irons maintenant au sénateur.
Senator Dalphond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Well, I address my questions to Mike and Jennifer Shooten, which I thank very much for being present with us today and offer my deepest condolences. If I understand well from the letter you sent to us in April and from the other letters you've published on various media, that be about abortions or MAID, you are of the view that, as Christian political activist, that a life is always worth living. That's your main philosophy. And I respect your views, and this is a matter of, it's entrenched in your political stance that you took. But when I read your letter, and that's April, and you said in that letter that the rapid pace of expansions has recently become very poignant for our family about the cancer of your son, in particular for our 18-year-old son. So when you wrote to us, your son was already 18 years old. I think he was born in March or April? July. So he was like close to being 18. He was already 18 and 7 months. So he was eligible to MAID for about 7 months before he decided to stop the treatment. And despite that he was admissible to MAID, he never asked for it. And it was never part of your discussions. So why are you so fearful if we extend MAID to mature minors that it's going to be changing your situation? Because your son and your family, because of your beliefs and your values, it was not an option you would consider, but you were mindful that it was available. He was over 18. He could have received it if he had applied for it, because he was obviously in a kind of, once he has stopped treatment, he was, unfortunately, that natural death was imminent, a matter of months or weeks. And so it did not prevent you from doing so. But as my colleague said, some other families believe differently, and we heard another mother that said her son, who was 17 and a half, was going through unbearable suffering, and he wanted to have access to MAID. So while we would deny access to MAID to that 17 and a half, because it will force you to apply for MAID, which you did not apply, and your son did not apply for it. So why should we deprive others of the choice?
Again, we were grateful to be invited here by you to share our experience with suffering and death of a child. When Marcus was 17 and diagnosed on February 26th, we were driving back to our home from the Vancouver BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver, and he said to us, he said, "Mom and Dad, this cancer sounds really bad. If they don't get it the first time, I might as well just go home to die because there's no chance." He understood from day one that this was terminal. And yet, all of his treatment was focused, first of all, on cure, yes, and then when it morphed into treatment for quality of life, it all emphasized the value of his life, no matter how sick he got, no matter how incapacitated he became. That is our experience, and we're grateful to share that. I would suggest if you would like to hear from people who have different experiences, you need to talk to them.
You did. That's
Thank
why
you.
we are. Your position is to deny access to these people. So that's what I understand. Thank you.
Merci, Sénateur Delphond. Senator Wallen for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. And my questions are for Jennifer and Mike, and obviously about their son Marcus. You have used the word on several occasions, obliged, and I'm wondering, did any medical professional, a doctor or a nurse or a MAID provider, come in and say to you, you must do this, you should do this, you have an obligation to do this? What exactly occurred in the final stages?
The word oblige, Senator, comes directly out of the CAMAP document, where they are recommending that physicians have an obligation to bring up medical assistance in dying with people.
Right, as they do the other options,
Exactly.
right.
So,
they have to lay out for patients all of the options to consider. But beyond that, did somebody come in and say, you are doing the wrong thing, we don't think your personal or religious views are acceptable, and we think that the best course of action is made and right now?
So, as you would have heard in our testimony, Marcus had all of his treatment at BC Children's Hospital, and he was cared for. His palliative and hospice care was provided through Canuck Place Children's Hospice, so it was not part of the conversation at those institutions.
Right. No, that's what I think we're just trying to, what my colleagues and I are trying to establish here, because it's a very, very important principle that MAID is about choice. And if you choose not to access MAID, nobody will ever challenge you on that as a parents or from the point of view of your son, of Marcus. Nobody can force you to do this because, in fact, you'd have to go through an assessment process. And if you were not interested in that, or if it offended your views, nobody could force you to do that.
I think we have to be very careful here. You would recognize, as we do, that the news this week is filled with people who have been led to despair because medical assistance in dying was offered to them. When you do the same to minors, children who have not the same capacity as adults, and their families who are simply trying to live each day well, that will lead to despair.
Well, I only, obviously don't have your experience, but having gone through this with people with whom I'm extremely close, I watched them choose to have MAID as an option. I watched them change their mind about the date. In one case to push it out, in one case to bring it closer, and they had that choice. So I think that's just what we're trying to say. We're all very sad about the circumstances you were in. I just wanted to reassure people that in no way can MAID be forced on someone against their will, or someone with the religious views of your son or the personal views that you may have, that it just isn't, even if they are suffering. I think by offering palliative care or MAID or whatever the options may be, that is not saying you are not worth life, you are not worth living. That is not the message that I hear.
And I would implore you to try to be open to that message. We were sitting in the first panel this morning listening in, and just to emphasize what was said there, the impact of the law is far greater than you might think it is.
Thank you, Senator Wallen. We'll now conclude with Senator Martin for 3 minutes.
To our witnesses this morning, Mr. Liu, I just want to commend you on the work that you undertook and the fact that you're doing some very important work to hear the voices of the mature minors. My question is sort of focusing on the importance of the specialized palliative care or palliative care. We've heard from previous witnesses about the state of palliative care in Canada and the fact that it's not the same across the country. And in your case, you had this very incredible experience of receiving hospice care and palliative care for your son. So how important that care is in addressing these end-of-life issues, or in the case of your son, to live well right to the end. So I'd love to get your perspective on the importance of palliative care, hospice care, and specialized palliative care in the time that remains for me.
When Marcus had his first negative scan, that was 6 months into his treatment. And already at that meeting with his oncology team, the Canuck Place Hospice nurses and doctors were part of that meeting. His palliative care was already engaged at that point. They knew Marcus. They knew our family. They knew how to care for him when it came time to transfer all of his care into the Canuck Place Children's Hospice from BC Children's Hospital. As I said earlier, it was incredibly comforting to know that they were always one step ahead of us. The resources that are allocated to the care for children who have terminal illness and are in a palliative condition appear to be far superior than those allocated to people in the adult world. As I shared, my uncle and his family spent the last few months of his life just scrambling around trying to find the right medication, the right treatment, what to do when, how to do it. Whereas every day when they would come to our house, the Canuck Place Hospice nurses, they would assess Marcus and say, I think we need this type of medication, or we need an extra dose of this type of medication to treat this, or let's bring in some more bedding or pillows or oxygen, whatever it had to be. They were always ahead of us. And that allowed Marcus to enjoy, as you see, even on the pictures, the very day before he passed away, to enjoy every moment he had that he was alive, and to not miss out on those unnaturally interrupted, beautiful experiences that would have happened if he would have chose medical assistance in dying far earlier.
Senator, you have about 20 seconds.
Okay, I'll just conclude. What I'm hearing is that it's important to the timing of the palliative care is not just attached to the end, but rather if it overlaps the care, the early care, that care can be seamless as a result of what happened in your case. And again, thank you very much. I will conclude, Mr. Chair, so I'm not in my question mode, but putting back my coach. Yes. So again, thank you very much for your testimonies as we end and conclude time with our witnesses. I think it was, again, just very eye-opening and compelling, and just want to thank each of you for taking the time to share your lived experience with us, as well as your insights among the young people whom you studied and in your report, Mr. Liu, thank you for sharing that with us as well. I'm told by the analysts, because we're going into draft instruction on Tuesday of next week, in order for you to submit your report, it would have to be very quick. So just wanted to let you know the timeline. And to my colleagues, this does conclude our study with our witnesses, and that on Tuesday we begin drafting instructions for our final report. If you recall, there's an email on November the 22nd from our analysts, so if you can review the instructions on that so that we can begin our drafting instructions on Tuesday. So with that, thank you so much to everyone, and I bring this meeting to a close.